Deal or no deal, it's crunch time for Brexit, the UK's departure from the European Union. Warnings of dire economic consequences if no deal is reached. Prime Minister Theresa May arguing her exit plan is the best. So is a deal possible? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hoda Abdelhamid. Brexit has been at the forefront of British politics since the country voted in a referendum for a divorce from the EU in June 2016. It's crunch time for Prime Minister Theresa May. She's traveling to Salzburg this week to try to reach a breakthrough with EU leaders. But many have already pushed back her Chequers plan. Brussels chief negotiator Michel Barnier saying it would spell the end of the EU project. And just 6 months ahead of the deadline for a Brexit, the head of the International Monetary Fund, Christine Lagarde, has given a stark warning. Leaving the EU with no deal could be costly for the British economy.
Let me be clear. Compared with today's smooth single market, all the likely Brexit scenarios will have costs for the UK economy and to a lesser extent as well for the EU. The larger the impediments to trade in the new relationship, the costlier it will be. The range of issues that remains to be addressed is daunting, as is daunting the small time left to address them.
In July, Theresa May presented her plan, named after the Prime Minister's country retreat, Chequers, and she said more than once it's the only deal she's willing to put forward. But divorce can be messy, and there are many sticking points, including how much the UK is willing to pay the EU. There are estimates the bill for divorce could be more than $50 billion. What happens to UK citizens living in the EU and EU citizens living in the UK? The plan allows for freedom of trade, but not for people. And what happens to the Northern Ireland border? This remains a major stumbling block. The EU has called for a border in the Irish Sea, the UK for a customs border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland.
It's important that we deliver for the people of Northern Ireland. They don't want a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. The only proposal that's been put forward that delivers on them not having that hard border and ensures that we don't carve up the United Kingdom is the Chequers plan.
So let's bring in our guests. Joining us in Warsaw, Jonathan Lees, Deputy Director of the think tank British Influence. In Oxford, Helen Thomas, CEO and founder of macroeconomic consultancy BlondeMoney. And in Lancaster, Geraint Jones, an economist at Lancaster University. A warm welcome to all of you. Helen, let me start with you. Basically, Theresa May is saying it's my way or the highway.
That's right. She has been abbreviated as, yes, my deal or no deal. And I think that she's right to pitch it like that, not least because we're running out of time. And, you know, there is a deal getting to be on the table. We have to see what Parliament makes of that. And then there's not much time left until the actual deadline next year, of course.
And Jonathan, I mean, in a certain way, the EU is saying more or less the same thing, even though not in those words, that it's either they get what they want or there's no deal either.
That's right. It's really a contest of red lines. The EU is saying that the single market can't be divided between the four freedoms and that there has to be a possibility of a customs union for Northern Ireland. And the UK is saying that the UK can't be in the customs union and it can't have free movement of people, and there can't be a border in the Irish Sea. So if you have two sides that both have their red lines, one of them's going to have to give. And the point is, the EU is more powerful than the UK, and for the last 2 years, the UK has been moving over to the EU side in the negotiations, and so that looks to be the trend now.
Well, Geraint, you know, we're 6 months away from the deadline, and nothing substantive has happened so far. do you think that Theresa May will be able to push her Chequers plan even within her own constituency? I mean, she's facing a lot of opposition.
It took the UK government a long time to settle on an approach to the Brexit negotiations, and when Chequers came out a couple of months ago, that was very late in the process. What it has proposed in Chequers is a very clunky system where countries collect border taxes on behalf of each other, and where there is also a common rule book across the UK and the European Union for the case of goods specifically. Now, whether that breaches red lines on the EU's part in terms of splitting up the pillars of the single market remains to be seen. There's certainly something there in Chequers that there is room for negotiation, but we'll need to see how far each of the parties is willing to go.
Well, Jonathan, talking about the fundamentals of the EU, I think one of the main problems here is being that if you can have a free movement of goods, but you can't have free movements of people.
Absolutely. The single market is, as far as the EU is concerned, it comes as a package. And the EU has staked its cohesion on this very point. So when Michel Barnier says that 80% of the withdrawal agreement is wrapped up, but it's a bit like saying that we share sort of 90% of our DNA with a fruit fly. It's the remaining 10 or 20% that's the clincher. And so if the UK insists on its Chequers plan that doesn't include free movement of people, the EU cannot accept it. And Theresa May has boxed herself into a corner because she's insisted that there can be no free movement of people. But if she continues with that line, there can be no Chequers either.
Okay, well, Helen, the IMF has been quite consistent, really, from before the Brexit vote, warning about the negative impact it could have on the UK. Now, Christine Lagarde is painting an even bleaker picture if there is no deal. So what does Theresa May do at this point?
Well, it's all very well to talk about the economics of the argument, but really it's all about the politics. That is what the deal is going to succeed or fail upon, is whether, and you mentioned it earlier, Theresa May can convince her own parliament of the merits of the Chequers plan, let alone in its negotiations with the EU. And as far as Christine Lagarde is concerned, I noticed in that comment you ran at the beginning of your report, she did say that although it would be bad for the UK, it would also be bad for the EU. And again, there is a politics versus economics that goes on as a calculation on the EU's side as well. So I think we can't purely look at this in just GDP or unemployment terms, although clearly that will be significant if we don't get a deal. But really, if we're looking at what's going to happen and how it's going to pan out, we really have to look at the politics of this. Okay, and
Geraint, in your opinion, will it have a negative impact, or is there a difference between deal or no deal when it comes to the British economy?
There's a huge difference between deal and no deal, and if it's a deal, it depends on what the nature of that deal will be. Chequers is certainly an improvement on no deal, but it leaves services outside the single market of the European Union, and that will make it difficult for services to trade within the European Union. In the case of no deal, the big problem there is that the EU will be obliged under WTO rules to impose tariffs on what it imports from the UK, and that will make British producers very uncompetitive as they try and export their products to the European Union. And that threatens employment, it threatens jobs, it threatens pay, it threatens GDP growth in the UK. And so no deal would be a very bad solution indeed for the UK. Also, it would be a bad solution for the European Union.
Okay, and Jonathan, you think actually that no deal is not an option, right?
No deal is absolutely impossible. For very clear reasons. As the other two panelists have said, it's a disastrous outcome for both the UK and the EU. But the UK has a lot more to lose than the EU because its economy is much more exposed, it's smaller, it's less powerful, and of course the the UK depends on EU infrastructure to ensure the basic running of our country, like aviation, for example. So planes will be grounded, according to the European Aviation Safety Agency, if we fall out with no deal. So if negotiations collapse in December, for example, then the economy would start to collapse very soon afterwards, and public support, if there was any, would vanish very quickly. And so Theresa May would have to then go to Brussels and ask for a deal on what she would consider to be very, very poor terms. So really, Brexit is a process of elimination. We know there can be we know that there won't be a no deal scenario, rather. So that means there will have to be a deal. And from then, it's just a question of deciding which deal it will be.
Okay, so Helen, if there is a deal, one does get the impression that really, especially when looking through the details of this Chequers plan, that Theresa May basically wants an a la carte menu where she can pick and choose what kind of relations or in which fields she will continue having deals with the EU, and in which other fields they will be Britain will go on its own. It's quite difficult, isn't it, to achieve that?
Well, she's obviously in a very difficult situation. I mean, this is the problem of having a minority government. It's also the problem because although 52% of the UK population voted to leave, more than half of the parliamentarians in the UK's parliament voted to remain. In fact, a significant number, more than half, voted to remain. So there is a friction there that has always dogged these negotiations, and unfortunately was made a lot worse by that election last year, where she was, of course, gunning for a big mandate and unfortunately got the exact opposite of that. So in terms of picking and choosing, I mean, yes, there's often a lot of criticism around what the UK is putting forward in terms of, you know, having cake and eating it. But of course, in any negotiation, as any of us would have gone through, you do have to put certain things forward, knowing you might get pulled back from what it is that you really want. So I think it's tough to criticise her Chequers plan necessarily on cherry picking, because a line had to be drawn somewhere, and she had to draw it based on the fact that her party is fundamentally split, and of course the nation is fundamentally split, and that necessitated trying to draw these red lines and sort of compromise into a least worst outcome. That means that, you know, we are left in quite a tricky situation with the clock ticking. There's basically a raft of poor options left, and it is a question of just how bad is the final outcome going to be.
Geraint, you know, one wonders, when the British people went to vote in 2016, were all the facts put forward, and is the Brexit they voted for back then the same as the one that is discussed today in Brussels?
No, in 2016, people were given the option to remain in the European Union, and it's pretty clear what that meant, or to leave. And it was very unclear what that meant. And there's been a whole menu of choices from the day after the referendum. It's been clear that we've had several choices to choose between when determining how we're going to leave the European Union. And what's become increasingly clear is that people didn't know what they were voting for, and that some people now are regretting having voted the way they voted, whichever way that was. They wish they knew more at the time, and that is really what's driving the movement towards the people's vote on the terms of Brexit that is gaining momentum.
Well, Helen, you're a Brexit supporter. Do you agree with what Geraint just said?
I don't regret my personal vote. I should add that, of course, that's just my personal opinion, and the work we do at my consultancy strives to be as independent and neutral about this as possible. And I would point to the fact that some recent surveys have shown that there has been regrets on both sides. You know, there's been regrets from people who voted to remain and from those who voted to leave. It is a thorny issue. The details are more complex than, of course, a simple Remain-Leave question forced upon us. That is the nature of referendums. That's what they do. And I would just say this about this concept about people knowing what they were voting for. When we come to a general election, there is a platform perhaps on health service, on should we have a national health service, what should it do? And the public will vote in that election based on their views about that, or on their values perhaps, not even the specifics. And they vote a mandate to the politicians, who then go on to implement it as they see best. That is what members of parliament are supposed to do. So I do take a little bit of concern about this concept that we didn't know what we were voting for, because that's not really how votes actually usually tend to work. If you even look at the Scotland independence referendum, yes, there was an awful lot more detail ahead of that referendum perhaps than this one, but it was a question of identity and beliefs and values, and the detail and the policy, well, that's what the politicians are there to implement.
Well, Jonathan, you seem not to agree with what has just been said, but just I have a question for you. I mean, this being part of the EU or not has been an issue within the Conservative Party, one could argue, for decades, and it came just all to the forefront now. But it's quite ironic that as it comes to the forefront, the Conservative Party is having an internal debate about it. And it's very difficult to understand at this stage if the pro-Europe or the anti-Europe voices within that party are the stronger these days.
Absolutely. I mean, it's ironic that we are talking about what people were voting for, because the Conservative Party can't even agree 2 years after the referendum. And the government is still divided over it as well. So in the Conservative Party, I would say there is a broad consensus to leave, but without any clear idea of how to do that. And that's where we again come to the people's vote, because there's no majority, it seems, in Parliament for the Chequers deal. There's no majority for no deal. I don't know if there's a majority for soft Brexit, but of course soft Brexit is despised by Leavers and Remainers because it gives EU integration, and it also makes us a lobbyist and vassal state, unable to vote on the rules which will determine our economic future. And so it could be that a people's vote becomes Theresa May's own way out, because she might reason that if she can't get anything through Parliament, then putting it back to the people is the right course of action. And I would also just say to Helen makes a comparison with the general election. In a general election, you get a chance to review your decision after 4 or 5 years. That wasn't the case of this referendum. So if people find that they were deceived or that they're not getting what they voted for, it's only right that they should be able to think again.
And Helen, just briefly, do you agree with the idea of a second referendum?
No, I don't. I think even with the people's vote, although I have sympathy with the analysis that Jonathan used there, if the people say no, then where are we left? We've got even less time and an even more divided parliament and recriminations, possibly a change of Prime Minister. Certainly her leadership would be even more in question than it is now. And it just seems to lead to more confusion. And I would say that there's been a number of polls which suggest that in quite a British way, that people just want them to get on with it and do something. And I think after 2.5 years, if we haven't got anywhere, to go back to the people is going to be a difficult pill for the public to swallow.
Okay, now, Geraint, we're in a situation where Christine Lagarde is warning about dire economic consequences for the UK. The EU is not very happy. And Theresa May is in a very difficult position. But do you think that all of this has also to do with the fact that at the beginning, Theresa May was never a Brexiteer. She voted against it. So maybe it's very difficult for her to bring that file forward, to push it ahead. Because, I mean, the UK has basically been peddling in the same position for the past 2 years.
I don't think we can say that this difficulty that we're in results from Theresa May being a Remainer. She was always a lukewarm Remainer at best. I think what has happened is that the whole process has hit against the buffers of reality. And there are certain aspects of Brexit that are very difficult to deliver, whoever tries to deliver them. Remember that the European Research Group last year pulled a document that they were considering publishing, making their own proposal proposals about how to achieve Brexit. They don't know how to do it either. So I don't think it matters who was in charge. This was always going to be an extremely difficult process.
Okay, Jonathan, what's very also difficult to understand, or surprising, I would say rather, is that we are in a world where you have these huge blocks. You know, China's economy is growing, Russia is making economic deals everywhere, the US is being more isolationist, and then you have the EU, and then you have the UK who wants to go on its own, maybe thinking that it will keep that special relation it's always had with Washington. That's not very clear at the moment, considering the sort of Trump's isolationist or protectionist policy. So was it the right time for this referendum to happen and for Brexit to go ahead?
Well, it's the worst timing ever now when we look at what's happening in the world, as you point out. If you see what's happening with Trump, we are being divided, we're being isolated to our west and to our east as well. So Trump is saying that he is going to always put America first, that it's about what America needs, and the UK will have no option but to pursue a trade deal with the US to try and stem some of the damage from Brexit. But Trump can therefore make almost any demands that he chooses, and Britain will have to comply. So that doesn't give us any kind of power, it doesn't give us any kind of sovereignty either. So really, yes, as you say, this is a terrible time to do Brexit. It will always be a terrible time to do Brexit anyway, but it's a particularly terrible time to do it now because we are very short of allies at the moment, and we're very short of options as well.
So, Helen, you know, it's not clear whether there'll be deal or no deal, and even in this conversation, we can't reach a consensus. But if there is no deal, at the end of the day, overnight, the UK would have lost many trade agreements around the world. It would have lost also access to many European institutions. And from what I read and hear, it's not really ready for that.
Well, the UK government's trying to be ready. You know, they have published a huge slew of technical papers over what would happen in no deal. You know, Theresa May's tried to respond to that. Of course, Mark Carney, Bank of England governor, was in talking to the cabinet about the stress test scenario of a decline in house prices of 1/3 and this kind of thing. So, you know, the preparations are trying to be made. I believe it's the same case over, you know, in the EU 27 as well. I think, you know, it's tricky, of course. It's certainly not going to be easy to just crash out and be on WTO terms. There is the non-tariff barriers as well, you know, above and beyond purely the numbers of tariffs. But again, I do come back to the politics of this, and grounding planes unilaterally doesn't help either side of the UK or the EU. I mean, it would really depend on how the EU 27 want to push things. And, you know, the EU 27 have their own debates that are currently ongoing. There's obviously a new
bring in
government.
Geraint 1 minute, because we're reaching the end of the program. Geraint, now, Theresa May is heading to Salzburg in a few days. She's going to meet with EU leaders in an informal kind of summit. How will she be able to convince them that it's her way or her deal or no deal?
It'll be quite difficult for her to make sure that she doesn't drift too far in the direction of going for a customs union plus single market solution, which would be unacceptable to a large part of her party. So that's what she's going to need to ensure. At the same time, she will need to persuade the European partners that it is possible to implement certain aspects of the Chequers plan that currently appear to be very clunky. So ensuring that countries can collect taxes at the border for each other, and ensuring that the proposals that she's come up with don't breach the principles of the single market that Jonathan was talking about earlier.
But there's very little time for her to convince them of that. The March deadline is fast approaching and time is running out, and also time has run out on this show. So thank you to all my guests, Jonathan Liss, Helen Thomas and Geraint Jones. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hoda Abdelhamid, and the whole Inside Story team here in Doha, bye for now.